The neutral tone in Mandarin Chinese can be tricky to learn. How is it pronounced? Is it a fifth tone? And how do you know when it should be used? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about the neutral tone. There are many misunderstandings regarding the neutral tone, so in this episode I want to clear them up. I will of course also go through the basics of the neutral tone so you know how it is pronounced, when it occurs, and so on. I will also address a question I see online quite a lot, and that is whether or not the neutral tone could be considered a fifth tone, so Mandarin would then have 5 tones rather than 4. Before we talk about the neutral tone in particular, I'd like to say a few words about tones in Mandarin in general, because this will be crucial for understanding why the neutral tone actually isn't a fifth tone, and truly understanding how the neutral tone works. If you know the basics of tones, just bear with me, I will just spend a few minutes on this, and then we will get into the juicy stuff about the neutral tone itself. So Mandarin Chinese has, as I think most of you know, 4 basic tones. We have the first tone, which is a high tone, that would be ma. Then we have the second tone, which is a rising tone, ma. And then we have a low tone, ma, which is usually in context pronounced just as a low tone, without the dip, i.e. without the rise at the end there. And if this is not something you feel familiar with, we did talk about the third tone specifically in episode 26, and I'll put a link in the show notes. And then, finally, we also have a fourth tone, which is a falling tone, ma. So what we're talking about here is that the tone height, or how the tone height changes across the syllable, actually is used to determine which word it is. And this is not intuitive for people who come from a non-tonal language, but it is a little bit akin to changing a vowel in English. So I think we would all agree that it's obvious that the word bat is different from the word bit. And the only thing we did there was to change the vowel. And just like that, in Mandarin, if you change the pitch contour, i.e. the tone height or how the tone height changes across a syllable, that also results in a different word. So for example, ma means mother, ma means hemp, ma means horse, and ma means to scold. This is as obvious for native speakers of Mandarin as bit and bat being 2 different words is for native speakers of English. If you're okay with that, I think we are ready to continue talking about the neutral tone, but if you do want to know more about tones in general, I put together a guide called the Hacking Chinese Guide to Mandarin Tones, and I'll put a link to that in the description. Now that we have that out of the way, we are ready to explain why Mandarin has 4 tones and not 5. The neutral tone is not a tone in the same sense that the regular tones are, but rather something that happens to unstressed syllables. A simple way of explaining this is to say that the neutral tone is in fact the absence of tone, which also explains why it would be a bit silly to count it as the 5th tone. This doesn't mean that the neutral tone doesn't have a specific tone height, but it does mean that pitch is not used to determine what the syllable means or in which words it is included. So while a word like ma has an inherent tone that you can't change without changing the word, this is not the case for the neutral tone. Instead, the pitch comes from somewhere else, and as we shall see, this is usually the preceding syllable, but it can also be other things in the context, such as intonation. This doesn't mean that the neutral tone is pronounced completely differently all the time. There is in fact a standard or default way of pronouncing the neutral tone, which might change in context but is usually the same. So for example, if you ask someone to just say one word that has a neutral tone in it, this is what most people will say, and this is also what you should learn. And then later you will find that sometimes intonation can overwrite or change this, but that is a little bit too much to deal with right now, so let's stick with the default pronunciation of the neutral tone. And as I said, it depends on context, so we need to look at the preceding tone. So after a high tone, the first tone, the neutral tone is lower. So for example, we have 杯子, that means cup or glass, 杯子. And you can hear that 杯 here is high, and then the z part is lower than the 杯, so 杯子. Then after a rising tone, that would be the second tone, the neutral tone is also lower than the end of the preceding tone. So here we might have a word like 儿子, 儿子, which means son, 儿子. So note that the z here again is lower. The low tone, the third tone, is somewhat of an exception here, as is usually the case with the third tone, because here the neutral tone is usually higher. So if we say something like 我们, as in us or we, 我们, the men here is higher than 我. 我 is very low and men is high. 我们. And then finally, after a falling tone, the fourth tone, the neutral tone is again low. But here we can't really go lower because the falling tone actually ends very low. So in a word like baba, father, dad, baba, the ba here is low, and of course the end of the first ba is also low, but we stay down there. This means that we have a rule of thumb. We can say that the neutral tone is pronounced lower, or if you can't go lower, then as low as the preceding tone. We also then need to remember that there is one exception to this, and that is after a third tone, where the neutral tone is high instead. This is not a very exact description, of course, but if you head over to the article on Hacking Chinese, which is as usual linked to in the notes, you will see exactly the tone height of each neutral tone depending on context. But this usually doesn't matter, you just need to remember that it's supposed to drop in most cases, except after a third tone where it's supposed to be high. In the written article on Hacking Chinese, I've also included pretty diagrams for these, so you can head over there if you want to check them out. If you want plenty of examples of neutral tones and words at your level that use the neutral tone, I also suggest you check out an article I wrote a while back, and this is also a part of the podcast. It was in episode 87, which is about focusing on tone pairs to improve your Mandarin pronunciation. And there I've sorted all the words in HSK based on tone, so you can see the easiest words first. So for example, if you're struggling with, say, the third tone plus a neutral tone, you can get all the examples you need in that article and you can practice them. I also want to mention my pronunciation course, in which I go through all elements of Mandarin pronunciation. That's of course not just neutral tones or tones in general, it's also initials, finals, prosody, and also how to learn these things. So this is a full video course where I take you through everything you need to know, and there is also a feedback option if you want direct feedback from me. The course is currently closed for enrollment, but it will open again in November. And of course, if you listen to this later, you can just head over to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com and you'll be able to sign up for the waiting list so I can notify you when the course opens again. Enough about that, let's get back to the neutral tone and talk a little bit about when you should use the neutral tone and how you're supposed to know this. And unfortunately, this is just one of those things you have to memorize. So just like you need to memorize if it's a first, second, or third, or fourth tone, you also just need to know that some words, they have a neutral tone. Another way to think about this is in terms of stress. So these words have a very clear stress on the first syllable and not on the second one, which results in this loss of tone. So in a word like 杯子, for example, the z here at the end is very short, and you can hear that the stress is on 杯. Of course, the best way to learn this is, as usual, to listen a lot, because then you will hear when someone says 爸爸, that it sounds good to say it that way and not 爸爸, which sounds very strange. Naturally, as a beginner, you don't have that feel for what sounds strange in Mandarin. That's what it means to give your brain enough input that you can figure out that this sounds strange, because it doesn't match the experience you've had with the language before. And this is why input, especially listening, is so important. Still, there are some patterns that will allow you to remember and sometimes even predict when a syllable is reduced and we therefore will have a neutral tone. And I'll go through 3 important ones here. The first one is that the neutral tone only appears at the end of words or between syllables, never at the beginning of words. So the vast majority of words in Mandarin have 2 syllables, and therefore the most typical case of neutral tone is a 2-syllable word where the second syllable is reduced and therefore has a neutral tone. That means that we have the stress on the first syllable and the second one is pronounced in a lighter manner, as it were. We never have the reverse of that, so you can never have a word that has 2 syllables and the first one is a neutral tone, for example. The second pattern you should know about is that particles often have a neutral tone, such as le, ma, de, and so on. And these are rarely pronounced on their own, and if you do pronounce them on your own, you kind of have to pronounce them in a weird way, like I just did. They are not natural to say on their own because they only occur naturally in context combined with other things. This pattern is often combined with the first pattern, so you have many constructions where a particle is squeezed between two other syllables. So for example, if you say 听不懂, the bu in here is not pronounced with the full fourth tone, but rather a neutral tone, 听不懂, not 听不懂. Another example would be 看得见, not 看得见. The third and final pattern is that suffixes typically have a neutral tone, and we've seen two examples of this already, as in 我们, so the men here is a plural marker, and it has the neutral tone. Then we have 杯子, the z here is a noun marker, and it also has a neutral tone. And another example might be 头, so that's the word for head, which is included in many, say, materials, so for example 石头, stone, or 木头, wood. It's not 石头 or 木头, which is what these words would sound like with full tones, although there are people who say that too, but more about that a little bit later. It's important to note here that it's not these syllables, morphemes, or words that have a neutral tone in and of themselves. So these usually can occur in other situations where they do have the full tone. So for example, if you say 子女, which means like son plus daughter or children, 子女, the 子 here definitely has a full tone. It is not a neutral tone. And 头, as in head, can of course also have a full tone. It usually has that when it means head. So if you say 头疼, as in headache, of course you say 头 with a full tone. So those were three patterns that I think are useful for getting a handle on the neutral tone, and sometimes, like I said, also being able to predict when there's supposed to be a neutral tone. And for example, if you encounter a noun that has this z at the end, you can be fairly sure that it is a neutral tone. So far, we have only talked about the neutral tone, but of course there will be situations where you need to read the neutral tone too, so you need to know how it's written down. Such as if you're looking something up in a dictionary, how is the neutral tone actually written down? There are a few common ways of doing this, and the most common one is simply to leave out the tone mark, so simply not write a tone mark at all. So if you write 杯子, 杯 then has the first tone mark, and 子 just has no tone mark at all. You can also write it with a dot before the syllable in question, so you write 杯 and then a central dot and then 子. Finally, it's also common to do this with a number, and it's either the number 5, so you would write 杯 1 and then 子 5. Or you can sometimes also say 0, so 杯 1 and then 子 0. There are more ways of writing down tones, including the neutral tone, and we actually spent the entirety of episode 102 talking about different ways of writing down Mandarin tones, so you can check that out if you want to know more. So far, we have only talked about how to pronounce the neutral tone in terms of tone height, but as I've said several times now, this is what happens on unstressed syllables, and unstressed syllables in most languages are reduced, which means that they are not pronounced as fully and as clearly as they would have been if they had stress. In Chinese, the neutral tone is called 轻声, so that literally means the light tone, and actually, in my opinion, this is a better name for it. If you look at a neutral tone, and now I mean if you look at a spectrogram or a waveform, you will see that it is kind of lighter. It is pronounced less loudly, and it's usually shorter as well. It doesn't make much sense to describe the images to you here on the podcast, but of course I've put the images in the article on Hacking Chinese. This episode is meant to be about the neutral tone itself, not syllable reduction in general, but it's also worth noting that other things happen to reduced syllables. And I've talked about this on the podcast before, and I think I used two examples then, and one of them was tofu. So that's tofu in Chinese, and it's a fourth tone followed by a neutral tone. But if you listen to people from northern China pronouncing this, it's fairly common that they drop the U entirely here and simply say tofu. This doesn't have to be so extreme, so when we have the final that is written simply with an E, this is pronounced in a much more relaxed manner when it's a neutral tone. So for example, you can compare the sound in de, le, and so on, with the full version, which would be de, le, and so on. And we have this in words like hungry, or re, warm. But when not stressed, this final is usually just pronounced just a central, nice, relaxed It's time to talk a little bit about variation when it comes to neutral tones, because no discussion about this topic would be complete if we don't mention regional and individual variation. The most notable difference is that stress works differently in northern dialects and southern dialects, and this has a big impact on the neutral tone. This is also reflected in the standard language, so we can, for example, compare the mainland standard with Taiwan standard, and we will see that the neutral tone is dealt with rather differently. So, for example, in mainland standard, it's 喜欢 with a neutral tone on 欢, whereas in the Taiwan standard, it's 喜欢 with a first tone on 欢. The same goes for 先生, which is with a neutral tone in mainland standard, but with two first tones in Taiwan standard, so 先生. A final example is 多少, which is with a neutral tone in mainland standard, but 多少 in Taiwan standard. Naturally, people don't speak the way their respective standards prescribe, so that means that what people actually say in the real world can be quite different. So, for example, in Taiwan, it's very common for words to be pronounced with a full tone, even though the standard prescribes them to be with a neutral tone. In fact, when brainstorming this episode and article, I wrote down a long list of words that I might use for various purposes that I thought were pronounced with full tones in Taiwan, but which have neutral tones in mainland standard. But then I found that most of these words actually do have a neutral tone in the standard language, it's just that people don't follow this. So, for example, words like 衣服, 漂亮, and 东西, they are all listed with neutral tones in the Ministry of Education dictionary, whereas most people I know in Taiwan actually do say 衣服 with a rising tone on 服, 漂亮 with two fourth tones, and 东西 with two first tones. This goes in the other direction as well. So in northern China, for example, it's common for people to reduce more syllables and therefore have more neutral tones than the standard prescribes, which means that the stress pattern sounds very different. For someone who has studied Chinese in Taiwan, it will feel like people in northern China, they don't pronounce things properly, they swallow lots of syllables, and they don't enunciate properly. Whereas someone who has learned Chinese in, say, Beijing, will feel that Taiwanese people enunciate everything a lot to the point of being a bit silly. I discussed regionally accented Mandarin and how to learn it more in episode 46 of the podcast, and of course I'll put a link in the notes. So let's wrap this up by summarizing some of the most important points that you should take with you from this episode. So the neutral tone is related to stress, and it's what happens to a syllable when it is not stressed. And this means that it's not a fifth tone, but rather the absence of a normal tone. Next, the default way of pronouncing the neutral tone is a bit lower than the preceding tone, except after a low tone, where the neutral tone tends to be high. Number 3, the neutral tone is usually indicated by omitting the tone mark, by adding a dot in front of the syllable, or by using the numbers 5 or 0. 4, it's also worth remembering that unstressed syllables are reduced in other ways too, so it's not just about the tones. Finally, don't forget that there is a lot of variation and that Mandarin is spoken by a vast number of people over a huge area, and some people will reduce a lot of syllables and some people almost none at all. This concludes our discussion about the neutral tone today, and if you want more in-depth explanations about Mandarin pronunciation, I suggest you check out my pronunciation course at pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.